On this week's edition of New York Now, we take a look at the biggest New York political moments of the last year. Then, as we start the new year, we look ahead at the policy issues and politics expected to shape the 2024 legislative session. I'm Chantel Destra, and this is New York Now.
Today, the Senate majority will pass legislation.
I will fight like hell for you every single day, like I've always done and always will.
Passing these bills on the floor, making yet another stand.
Welcome to this week's edition of New York Now. I'm Chantel Destra. It's the start of a new year and a new legislative session at the state capitol. This year, the governor and state legislature are expected to address several ongoing policy issues, including housing, which the pair failed to come to an agreement on a comprehensive housing plan last year. This year is also an election year, which means state legislators will be working to get votes, all while trying to push their respective legislative agendas for the next few months. The start of the new legislative session means the governor is set to give her State of the State address, sure to be filled with her vision and framework for the year ahead. The governor has already started giving some insight into her vision, previewing several proposals this week. Tune into our live coverage of Governor Kathy Hochul's State of the State address on Tuesday, January 9th at 1 p.m. and at nynow.org. But as we look ahead at what this new session will bring, we wanted to first take a step back and recap some of the political, news, and policy issues that made for an eventful legislative session in Albany last year. It may be hard to remember all that took place last year as we gear up for what is sure to be an eventful year in state politics, which is why we're joined by David Lombardo of the Capitol Press Room, Zach Williams of Bloomberg Law, and Nick Reisman of Politico. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Now, as we know, last year was a very eventful year in state politics, but I wanted to start off with Governor Kathy Hochul. At the start of the year, she had come off of a win of a very competitive gubernatorial race. I don't need to remind you guys, but then she was met by a very interesting legislative session filled with high highs and low lows. So where did this session leave the governor politically?
I think going forward, one thing that Governor Kathy Hochul is really going to have to try and do a reset on is this housing issue, yes, which is going to be a major thing for her going into this election year, not for her, but for all 213 members of the state legislature. So, I think the politics for the governor looking at, 2024, she was able to get some wins, as you mentioned last year, like a minimum wage increase, something that she had actually supported and worked with the legislature to get a compromise on. But housing was like the big thing that remained kind of an outstanding issue for her. And it was really kind of swallowed up in the politics of New York State. You had a number of progressives who wanted tenant protections that real estate interests were opposed to. And then you had a number of moderate suburbanites who were opposed to the housing mandates in her proposal.
And I think the politics surrounding housing have really only gotten worse in the last year. The idea of some grand bargain that's going to be struck appeasing everybody on the left, center, and right is even harder to do in an election year when I think the status quo is politically more convenient for some of those people down ballot who would rather see nothing done on housing than potentially risk the ire of voters by imposing some sort of tenant protections or, as Nick said, those mandates on new housing creation.
One interesting dynamic, I think, coming into this year compared to last year is the absence of crime, really, as the big issue. That really cost the governor dearly on the campaign trail. Coming into this year, though, crime is down. It's kind of gone back a little bit in terms of the political agenda. Now, it could always come back. You never know with this. But what is interesting is it really exacerbated her relationship with the political left, added a lot of pressure on political moderates who are looking towards, re-election this year. So I think the governor can at least take a little bit of solace in the fact that, crime isn't quite the big issue that it was last year when she really had to strong arm and push the legislator to change bail reform, among other things.
Yeah, and it seems like, in recent years, bail reform has been the sticking point of budget negotiations time and time again. And, I don't have a crystal ball, but I feel comfortable saying that it might come up again, right? So what exactly is the path forward this year?
So I think when you talk about the budget, it's been a lot about policy in the past. I think this year's budget, though, is largely going to be a fight over dollars and cents.
Right.
Heading into this fiscal year, there was talk last year from budget officials about a $9 billion deficit. That was rolled back down to about $4.5 billion in the fall. The governor's drawn a hard line in the sand on new taxes. The legislature, for its part, has some elements that will talk about increasing taxes. But I think at the end of the day, there won't be a clamor for increasing taxes unless we're actually facing cuts, and not just slower growth than normal, but actual cuts to some of the sacred cows, whether it's education or healthcare. And so I think that is going to be the big fight in the next couple months, is finding a way to close that $4.5 billion deficit. And I think enough people have been here in Albany to see, a few $1 billion here and there. We can find that in the couch cushions, and no hard choices have to get made.
Yeah, it is hard to think that $4.5 billion can be chump change, but to a large degree, compared to prior budget years, Dave's right. It really can be. I think one of the bigger, more contentious issues that you will see vis-a-vis the budget is going to be the migrant crisis, and how responding to the influx of hundreds of thousands of people into New York over the last year and a half or so is going to be addressed. Mayor Adams, obviously, in New York City, would like to see some federal help. He would also like to see additional state assistance. The governor has really signaled here that she is no longer willing to fund these open-ended hotel stays in New York City. So one thing she's going to try to do is shift a lot of that money from those hotel stays and from sheltering into, say, legal assistance or helping migrants find jobs in order to find something of a semi-permanent solution to this issue that, again, is very politically fraught for Democrats going into this year.
And let's not forget about Medicaid. It's, along with education, the biggest part of the budget. 1199, the most powerful union in the state, and the hospital industry are pushing for higher reimbursement rates for providers. Republicans and Democratic lawmakers are both on board with this, and this just adds more pressure to the rest of the budget. If increases in Medicaid get approved, and there's a budget deficit, that's just going to add more pressure possibly for cuts or for limiting increases on other things. And Medicaid is just that one big budgetary animal that nobody seems to be able to kind of get control of over the years. The governor has some super-duper commission that's supposedly going to find solutions to all this. I'm not too optimistic that anything fundamentally will change. I think just like past years, Medicaid costs will go up, and that's just going to make things tougher on the rest of the budget.
So do we think we'll get an on-time budget this year? Last year, the budget was, very late. What about this year?
I mean, the safe money is no, we will not have an on-time budget. Nobody, I think, has ever lost a lot of money betting against the possibility of an on-time budget.
Yeah, I mean, it's the $200 billion question, give or take a few billion, right? It's one thing I'm going to be interested to watch for is whether the governor uses any of her innate leverage that she has in the budget process to try to get lawmakers to the bargaining table and get a spending plan done by around April 1st. One potential leverage point here is the redistricting issue that we've seen reopen here with the new drawing of congressional lines as ordered by the state's top court. And yes, this is really only the House of Representatives. The Senate and Assembly are not affected, but there are going to be lawmakers who are going to be looking at some of these lines and thinking to themselves, well, if a certain line is drawn this way or if a boundary is drawn in the other way, I could eventually run for the U.S. House of Representatives. And so there is some leverage that Governor Hochul has here with redistricting, with the budget. Will she be able to use that leverage? Will she be able to use that power in order to get what she wants in the budget by around April 1st?
And you mentioned the redistricting commission and the saga that's ongoing with these maps. So what is the smart play here for Democrats? I know that, obviously this is not a new issue, but how can Democrats sort of not tempt themselves from, being too, not going over the line in terms of
greedy. They don't want to be greedy.
Greedy, thank you.
And if they are greedy, then Republicans will bring them back to court, and Republicans could eventually win, and then wash, rinse, repeat. We're back with this redistricting process.
Have they learned their lesson?
What happened with the House maps last time around was a rejection on process, not necessarily on gerrymandering.
There was a partisan gerrymandering complaint when it came to the House lines as well, though. I mean, there was that process thing that ultimately killed it. But there was that partisan issue. They did get too cute by half with how far they went with some of the lines.
the Long Island House District, I think, was one that a lot of people, like the
Long
South
Island,
Shore of Westchester, and
Long
then the Great Gatsby West Egg part of Long Island all drawn together was a bit much. But if Democrats are able to, adjust these lines so that things are a little bit better for them, say in Central New York with Congressman Brandon Williams' seat in the Syracuse area, and then if you go down into the lower Hudson Valley, the mid-Hudson Valley with Mark Molinaro, and then out on Long Island, well, then Democrats are potentially in business here in New York to even have a real chance of flipping the narrowly divided House and make Brooklyn's Hakeem Jeffries Speaker of the House, and they'll be able to do it through New York. Republicans are also very well aware of this, and they're going to be funding, at least tens of millions of dollars, not $100 million, to try to keep the House in their hands.
Right.
It's critical to remember just a few tweaks here and there could really affect the House map. Brandon Williams won in 2022 by a very narrow margin. A few changes in that Central New York district could maybe sway it the Democrats' way.
If he gets Tompkins County, he's done. I think that's the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, and you got to keep in mind too that the Democrats might be interested in playing a little defense as well. Pat Ryan in the Hudson Valley, top target of Republicans. A few changes here and there could go from a real swing district to something that's maybe more lean Democratic, maybe even safe. We'll have to see. Probably not safe, but it was a narrow race, and a few changes here and there on Long Island, Hudson Valley, Central New York could really change things, change Democrats' fortune.
Now, there is a caveat here. As Dave mentioned, there's really only so much Democrats can do in order to game these seats so that they're able to win these. They can't do it in such a way that's markedly unfair, but they also cannot draw, say, Congressman Mike Lawler in the Westchester, Rockland County area so that it's a much more Democratic-friendly seat that could, in turn, make life a lot easier for somebody like Mark Molinaro. Same goes on Long Island, where they're trying to pick up, at the very least, not just the George Santos seat in the special election on February 13th, but also Anthony D'Esposito's seat, Nick Lota as well. So there's only so much that can really be moved around in this jigsaw puzzle before things start to be a little tougher for, say, some Democratic moderates and easier even for some Republicans.
And it's possible, though, we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves because in early January, when we're talking right now, there's still the pen is held by the Redistricting Commission. And, when the first go around, there was an assumption that that pen would be taken away from them and the Democrats in the legislature would ultimately draw the lines. There could be a calculus from the Senate and Assembly Democratic leadership that, okay, let's see what the commission is able to draw up, and maybe these lines are palatable to us, and we don't want to risk a court challenge, so we're going to take this redistricting commission's work, and we're going to live with it. Right. So it's possible we might not even get to that point where there's that backroom line drawing by Democrats where they are considering these hard questions of how much do we move, how much do we take. Maybe in a perfect good government world, the redistricting commission has the final say.
If they can agree on a single set of maps. No, they didn't.
Right. Well, and if they deadlock, then it goes to the legislature. But I think the bottom line is here: what happens with the Independent Redistricting Commission, as it's called? Independent's not my word. It's but what happens with the Redistricting Commission, and then ultimately how the legislature and the Governor Act really could determine who controls the House of Representatives and the course of the country for the next 2 years.
Right. And, that is the congressional races, but what about the state Senate and Assembly races next year? How do lawmakers balance their respective legislative agendas and, running for re-election or election next year?
I think in the state Senate, everyone's always looking in the suburbs of New York City, particularly. Long Island is a place where the Democrats really, in 2018, 2020, almost eliminated all the Republicans in the state Senate. But now the Republicans have, really clawed back. Now I think it's 6 of 9 are Republicans.
They have 7.
7?
Yeah.
Boy, it's hard to keep track. So Democrats are definitely going to try to make another push on Long Island, get back some of that territory, especially Nassau County. And, I think that could really be where Democrats either go well beyond that supermajority once again, or maybe just little by little the Republicans bring it below a supermajority and maybe even come within, a half dozen seats or something of the majority. But Republicans regaining the majority, I don't think that's
if you're a sitting member of the legislature right now, particularly in the state assembly, you're not necessarily worried about a general election challenge from a Republican. You're much more worried about a challenge to your left flank in a Democratic primary from, say, somebody who has Democratic Socialists of America ties, or an endorsement from the Working Families Party. That is a major concern, especially in the state assembly, which we have seen become, quite frankly, and I think a lot of people would agree, even in the assembly, further and further to the left. And you still have some moderates from upstate New York, from the suburban areas of New York, who are a little bit more moderate, but you are seeing increasingly progressive lawmakers get elected after winning Democratic primaries, especially in Queens, in Brooklyn, and other parts of New York City, and even up into the Hudson Valley. So the state assembly is changing, and that could have real reverberations down the road for Governor Hochul, who has a much different statewide constituency that's a lot more moderate.
And hanging over all of these elections, whether it's the primaries or the general, is a public campaign finance system that's going to take effect in 2024. And like Nick just laid out, that's going to be a boon for some of these progressives who are mounting primary challenges to Democrats and then turn to the general election. I think it's going to be helpful for Republican outsiders who are trying to take on Democratic incumbents. The system was basically held up by Governor Hochul with a veto at the end of the year by some of the incumbent Democrats who were looking to make the system a little less friendly for these challengers. There was a bill that would have made the threshold for qualifying higher, would have allowed for larger contributions to get maxed out with public financing dollars. All seemed to be beneficial for incumbents. That was struck down. So it's really going to be interesting to see how this impacts these races, which are coming up sooner than we expect, with June primaries, and then November will be here before we know it.
Yeah, so there's a lot there in terms of the elections next year. But going back to the legislative session, earlier we touched on housing, we touched on bail reform. So what are some of those other big policy issues that we should be paying attention to heading into next session?
Well, I'm very partial to tech in my job, and while it's not the highest profile issues by any means, it arguably affects everyday New Yorkers as much as anything else. Data privacy. California, New York now is the largest state without a comprehensive data privacy law. Now, what does that mean? It means New Yorkers have no right to know what data big tech companies, Facebook, for example, actually collect on them. Now, there's what advocates call good data privacy laws and bad data privacy laws. Some states have adopted one that like Virginia, have adopted laws that are very industry friendly. California's law is held up as a real example of something that's very aggressive for the consumer. Another issue that's likely to come up, whether it's the big issue, probably not, is artificial intelligence. New York has fallen behind of other states. I think in 2023 we saw more and more states at least start to study this new technology, generative AI, ChatGPT, that type of stuff, and how it might affect state government, how it's already using automation. We've seen these controversies recently in New York City with NYPD using facial recognition software and stuff like that. So, while these issues probably aren't going to affect the elections and thus might take a backseat from most lawmakers, they're very important for New Yorkers. And while everyone's paying attention to the redistricting and housing and all these other important things, industry lobbyists are working hard to push all these regulations and laws in their favor.
Mayoral control of New York City schools is up this year. That's a major issue for Mayor Eric Adams, who, by the way, is facing some of his own issues right now with a federal investigation into his campaign. He is accused of any wrongdoing, but it's certainly something that's kind of looming over the mayor as he is trying to get his agenda through Albany, and that really does start with an extension of mayoral control of the city school system. And I was talking to a handful of lawmakers about this who have been holding hearings on education issues, not just in New York City but statewide, and they do plan on grilling him about this, on how this should be extended, whatever changes they may like to see. They may try to push through over Adams's objections, who said the other day that he would like to see a straight extension of it, as other mayors, as his predecessors, have gotten in the past.
There's also going to be some pressure on the governor to address the rollout of recreational marijuana in New York. There have been some comprehensive bills addressing farmers' needs, addressing the tax structure for recreational product. Whether that actually moves in the legislature remains to be seen, but I think there's going to be a growing chorus in both houses of the legislature that something needs to be done, potentially tucking it into the budget, because there could be some economic ramifications if they do change the tax structure of the recreational marijuana sales.
Yeah, and there are Democratic majorities in both chambers, but if you're a Republican lawmaker, is there a world in which you could have your agenda pushed forward? What should the playbook be for Republicans?
Well, they're going to have to try to get some sort of Democratic support because, this is quite frankly the way things work in Albany is if you are in the majorities, winner take all when it comes to, getting their policies through. But one thing that will be interesting is it's been an issue that you've seen largely Republicans talk about, but you're also starting to see some Democrats raise some concerns about this, and that is the outmigration of people from New York. We're seeing a steady stream of people leave the state, and it's not just the richest of the rich, which is going to have real ramifications for our tax revenue and for how New York State budgets, but also people who are making what we would consider to be middle-class incomes. They're just finding New York State and New York City in particular too expensive to live in. And so there is going to be a real discussion, I think, from even some Democrats over how to address this issue of living in New York. I mean, housing is probably one answer in reducing the cost of housing, but there are going to be kind of a wide array of menu options for lawmakers to consider here on this out-migration question. It's been a Republican issue in the past because it's largely been something that has affected upstate New York and upstate New York's political power. But we are starting to see it affect all of New York State's political power because we're losing congressional representation as a result of this. We're going to lose probably 2 House seats in the next round of redistricting after the 2030 census, and we lost 1 after the 2020 census. So this is a serious problem for New York. It's diluting New York's political power. It's diluting New York's economic power nationally. And lawmakers from both parties are probably going to have to come to some sort of way of addressing this issue.
And, it'd be really interesting to see it approached in something that's not just jobs and economic development focused. I think over the years, especially under her predecessor, economic development was kind of seen as, as the way to solve out-migration, at least from upstate. Create jobs and people will start living in Syracuse in increased numbers again.
The Buffalo Billion.
The Buffalo Billion. And we've seen, and under this governor, the Micron deal in Syracuse to bring microchip development, semiconductor manufacturing to Syracuse. That may or may not work out. But, a lot of the reasons that Republicans bring up for why New Yorkers are leaving are things that don't really have much to do with economic development. Taxes. Some, maybe cite, political liberalism as somehow driving people out. Issues of personal liberty, that type of thing. Bottom line is, it's not just about jobs, but it's been treated as pretty much just about economics and jobs for many years. And it'd be interesting to see how Democrats might take the ball and push it into new directions. Whether or not they're successful, we'll see.
Right. I mean, the big challenge is here, like after the COVID pandemic, it's easier to work from wherever nowadays. Right. You do not necessarily have to work in the state in which your company is based. And that means you can work out of your home office virtually 5 days a week. And that makes it a lot easier for people to move to different parts of the country. You can live in Idaho or Utah and work for a New York-based financial company, for instance. So there is going to have to be some sort of reckoning here with addressing that it is easier than ever for New Yorkers to become North or South Carolinians or Floridians or Texans or whatever you want to say, because that is going to, at the end of the day, it is a jobs and economic issue because New York is losing people. That means New York is losing tax dollars.
And unfortunately, we do have to wrap up soon, but in the last couple of minutes, I'd just love to hear from each of you what you all are looking to reporting on this year. Are there any threads that you're hoping to pull on as we start the legislative session?
So I'm watching the higher education budget in 2023. They were able to succeed in getting an investment in SUNY, but now 2024 comes, and they're saying we're going to have long-term deficits that really need to be addressed. Is the governor going to look to make more investments in SUNY, or will they finally increase tuition, which is what they were trying to do in 2023 and got ultimately blocked?
What's the impact of the legislative session, the policies that are passed at the state level? What's that effect going to have on the House races going into this year? We've seen Republicans in the past take a lot of the Democratic controversies that have come out of Albany and use them quite effectively in campaigns. So will there be an impact this time around?
I'm always looking for the unexpected train wrecks. I think, the whole Israel-Palestine issue came up last year. You would think it would have nothing or very little to do with state politics, but people feel very strongly, and I think especially with following the October attack, by Hamas. Just there's kind of a lot of boiling anger among some Democrats against their more leftist colleagues, particularly those associated with the Democratic Socialists of America. And, to what extent this might affect things that have nothing to do with Israel-Palestine, we'll see. But, already you got some members saying they're just not going to work with certain people ever again. And, I would not be surprised at all if, like, the settler bill comes up again or anything else that just starts a huge dumpster fire in the legislature.
Well, there's a lot to look forward to this year, but we'll have to leave it here for now. Thank you so much for being here. And we were speaking with Dave Lombardo of the Capitol Press Room, Zach Williams of Bloomberg Law, and Nick Reisman of Politico. And you can join us every week to get the latest on the 2024 legislative session. Next week, we'll be joining you live with coverage from Governor Kathy Hochul's State of the State address, Tuesday at 1 p.m. You can also visit our website for more. That's at nynow.org. That does it for this episode of New York Now. Thank you for tuning in, and see you next week.
Funding for New York Now is provided by WNET,